Today's episode is brought to you by elitefts.com, founded in 1998 with the primary aim to live, learn, and pass on. Please help Elite FTS support this mission by smashing the like button, leaving a comment, sharing with a friend, and thinking of Elite FTS for your training needs. If you can put it in a gym bag or load weights on it, Elite FTS has it. Now, onto the show.
What's going on? I'm Dave Tate. We are broadcasting from the middle of the Elite FTS weight room, where the underground still thrives and you're part of the crew. It's time to sit down, keep it real, and cut the bullshit. Welcome to Table Talk. What's going on, guys? We are back with another edition of Table Talk. If you've been following, last week we said that we were going to have John Meadows on. John is sick, so he's got an old school cold, so he's hacking up a lung and he's doing all the old school cold things.
Yep.
So I don't want to have him come out if he's not feeling well, so we'll reschedule that, have him come out at a later time. So when we were deciding what topics to do for this, we decided to go back and just have Sam and I, and we were going to talk about current events, but then this popped up, so we figured this would be more important. So I'm going to let Sam take over from here, and we'll just kind of let this roll.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you have been following us on YouTube, on Instagram, all over the place, we just published a video with Juji going over his deadlift. Dave and Juji did a really big, awesome deep dive into Juji's specific needs for the deadlift, right? Mm-hmm. And we got a lot of questions about, I may be weak off the floor. I may do this, all this, and all this. And I think one of the main things I want to go over with you today is just how in-depth of a process it was for you to make that video. It wasn't just roll up with a notebook and a couple numbers written down, right? Like the process going into understanding who you were going to work with and all the information that's needed for that to make a really good kind of a push for him. And I think nobody really understands that. And I think a lot of people, especially coaches, need to understand how much front end legwork that you personally put into that video. Yeah,
I made some notes on this as well, because when you threw the topic out, I like the idea because I can use Juji as kind of a case study on where I think a lot of the shortfalls are happening with programming. And I understand where the shortfalls are coming from, because working in the industry as a trainer for so long and consulting for so long, I see what's going on, in the industry from that part, to where, to say this as politely as possible, to lay out a good program, a good structured program, is not going to be time effective for most trainers, because if they're an online trainer, they're probably making somewhere between $100, maybe $250 per month, to where if I'm to consult with somebody on their programming, it's going to be $550 for a few hours, on a weekend. And that's not just, even if that's just for a couple hours, there's still a lot of hours that go in before that. But the problem is, if I was to lay out a program the way that I think it needs to be laid out, then what we're going to talk about a little bit today, before meeting with a client that I don't know if they're going to be around for more than a month, 2 months, or 3 months, I'm putting in an insane amount of time and insane amount of work for somebody that isn't going to have the return. Your return's going to be cents on a dollar, so it's going to be very, to be very low. So I know where this is coming from. And so for a lot of programming that's out there, I just call it kind of front-loaded program. They throw one workout out, it's going to be regressed to a certain degree, and then each workout after that is just going to kind of progress over a period of time. And it's a feeling out period, to where the coach is trying to figure out what's going on, the client's trying to figure out what's going on. Nobody's really vested in the real success of anybody outside of just picking low-hanging fruit, which has its need, it has its place. And hell, I had personal training clients that showed up once a week for years. I mean, I can't create annual plans for that.
Oh, yeah, no.
So it's just health training, which it's better than nothing. It's a lot of it's even less optimal than old gym classes were, but it changes when that person becomes more compliant. and it's a 3 or 4 day a week training process. And so I understand why it's going there. So I can't fault, the people that are doing that. I can fault them if they're trying to position themselves like they're experts, and they're not. So to get to your answer with Juji, a part of that was, it was presented to me like he wanted to build his deadlift, and it's like, okay, that's one metric, it's one variable, but how many other variables are important to him, and how do they intervene over a period of a year or multiple years? So for that, I had to look back, into his YouTubes, into his Instagrams, I'm trying to look at how he's trained over the past few years. So the one clear marker that came out right away is he competed in the same powerlifting competition for basically every year for the past 3 or 4 years. So from there, I know, okay, this is typically, I think it was in March or something like that, March or April. Every year there's a peak for him for the strength, which that falls there. So maximal strength is at a peak. What else is falling in there? Usually about once a year, you're going to see that at least the past few years, he gets a little more lean. And he talked about bodybuilding shows, and the COVID kind of canceled that, and he's talking about it again. So there's another phasic process that's happening. And then where is that happening? It's usually happening a few months away from where that max strength was. So at that point in time, I'm starting to realize this guy has annual plans. He's starting to lay things out. So from dissecting and auditing all that, well, what falls in those other areas? Well, a lot of what he does is his tricking. So where's that the most prevalent? Where does that fall in the heaviest point? And that's pretty easy to see if you're looking through when most of his heavy tricking type things are happening during a certain season, which falls there. So now I'm able to start to block out where these things are falling, and I'm seeing the repetitive pattern that he's blocking those same things out now. So I'm seeing that he is laying his program out in a phasic nature with everything falling at a certain period of time. Backtracking from there, then it was what other things are the priorities for him, because he's a multi-sport athlete, or he called it something else.
Polyathlete.
Polyathlete. To me, it doesn't matter. So it's a multi-sport athlete. It's multiple disciplinary skills that have to be developed over a period of a year, that in his case, it wouldn't be that conducive for that periodization structure to become conjugate, right? Because there's conflicting motor abilities and conflicting sport skills happening at the same time.
Just like with Missy that we talked about.
Yes. Yep. So the maximal strength and the tricking, for instance, isn't going to fall in that same period very well, where the bodybuilding and the tricking will have some overlap. So you're starting to be able to see, at least I'm starting to be able to see as I'm going through taking all these notes on how these blocks are going to lay out, how they're going to transition in between each one, and then how that lies. Now with the deadlift being the case, now I have something to work back on based upon an annual plan, actually a quadrennial, to be able to look back. And I got his deadlift markers for the past 3 years. And it's like, so I'm seeing, okay, out of all the metrics that he needs to go in the direction he wants him to go, obviously muscle mass is one. The other one is the tricking ability, which I don't know how much of that he's actually trying to build upon, but he's certainly trying to maintain it. I didn't go down the road of discussing how much to build upon that, because I don't do that. So I'm not the expert there. That's for him to speak to somebody else about.
Yep.
But I am very concerned that it maintains, because if it drops, and that's a big part of his livelihood, that's a big part of why he's training. And I don't care why somebody trains. That's their passion. That's their goal. I only care about trying to help them do that. So looking back over that, basically a quadrennial, and seeing that the jumps and the deadlift haven't been the same, because I know the muscle training, the hypertrophy training, that's working. Look at him 3 years ago. Look at him now.
He's a different animal now,
right?
Yeah.
I know the tricking's being maintained. Look at it 3 years ago. Look at it now. I know the squat strength, which is important to all these skill sets, is going up. Look at it 3 years. Look at it now. So by going through and auditing all of his training and looking at the specific questions I'm going to go over here in a minute, I'm eliminating all the things that I know I don't have to look at.
Right.
And when you eliminate all the things that you don't have to look at, you're going to begin to expose the things that you can have discussions about and talk to him about, which is what all the pages and notes that I had that I was going with him before, because there's questions that I'm going to have there. There's thoughts and ideas you're going to have going into it, but some of those have to be validated. Some of those have to be killed, you know, and then some of them are going to be exposed that I didn't think of, where there's multiple, say, obviously he's stated many times and other people stated he's weak off the floor. Well, what the fuck's that mean? I mean, that can mean a lot of different things. So the reason I went with the deficits over, I could have gone off another direction. You know, you can be weak off the floor because you don't know how to initiate starting strength. You don't know how to initiate that force. He's an explosive athlete. I've seen through 3 years of videos, he can go from a dead stop to a very high explosive position. He can generate the force. Now, is it possible that he's not generate the force against the barbell? Possibly. But in most of the positions and most of the deadlifts I saw, he was initiating the force, and he was starting from a good position to be able to initiate force. So his body wasn't breaking at the start of the pull. That's showing a loss of transfer of force. It's being maintained that whole way. So that starts to eliminate. The reason I'm putting out there is if he's weak off the floor, I could have addressed it by creating more force off the floor. So speed work, things like that, where if that was the direction I was going to have to go, then a deficit would be a terrible thing to do.
Right.
Because it lowers the ability to generate force the higher you go. So when people will see the video and they're like, hey, I also can't pull off the floor, and so I need to do deficits. Well, maybe, you know, but is that what the problem is?
Well, the idea of a technical cue being an issue, a physical weakness, or mental, right? That's usually how it goes, right? Just trying to figure out, like, and as the coach, you need to be able to decipher what direction you want to go to. And I think one of the best things that you did with Juji is the conversation that you had before he even touched the bar. I wish we filmed the entire thing. We could have had that whole conversation, because all those factors that you had mentioned with the prep that you put in all played a part throughout that whole session at one point or another. So if you were to look at the main picture, it would look like all these things kind of line up. But when you're in it, it's like these scatter plots, right? Where you're just trying to get this thing to go in that direction. So I thought that was really cool.
Well, the weak points are always going to be technical, physical, mental.
Yep.
So I have those on my list here to be able to discuss as well. And the thing with the mental aspect is you can't just come out and say, you know, are you scared to pull off the floor? You can't, because nobody's going to say, well, yeah, I am.
Especially if they're already strong, like they're already at a certain point.
So that's a real hard one to kind of get at. And I would say it's impossible to get at unless you're working with people in person to be able to read the nonverbals and so forth.
Right.
But I did see through several of his videos to where he said that his sticking point is off the floor. He always misses off the floor and certain things like that. So what I was trying to do, I knew I had to address that because that's always going to be there if it's implanted in there. So I needed to get him to say that to me without me coaxing it out of him.
Right.
So then the goal would be able to get it to say it to you a few times. So then you can throw it back and say, hey, look, you know, it's been a few times that you've said this, you do understand. And then you can kind of address it that way to at least make them aware of that, because that is a factor. You know, it does play a role. But to backtrack a little bit, when it comes to laying out a program, you know, you can lay out a series of workouts. And that's pretty much what everybody does, is if it's bodybuilding, what training split are they going to do? Then they figure out what they're going to do for the week and they just lay out the workout. They don't even think about how maybe I should rest the day before legs, or maybe I need to rest after legs. Not a whole lot of thought goes into that. When it's, you know, other training programs, it's usually just finding something that somebody else has written or finding something that somebody gave them. But basically there's no thought that goes into it. So if you're auditing a program or a person, kind of like what I was doing there's certain questions, and I wrote them down so I don't miss any of them, that it's always kind of going through my head with any of the training somebody's doing. And the first one would be, is it necessary? You know, is this exercise necessary? Is the training even necessary? Right. So if in his case, let's say all he wants to do is the tricking. Well, then there's going to be a lot of stuff in this training that I'm going to start going through and saying this isn't necessary for what you're doing. The sports skill is this. This is not going to have dynamic correspondence to that sports skill. So that doesn't need to be there. When it's multidimensional, there's still things you're going to try to go through there, say, is it necessary? Or when you're prescribing or you're suggesting something to somebody, you got to ask yourself, is this necessary? That's the first thing, because training economy matters.
So that needs assessment, right?
Yes. So is it necessary? Then is it specific? So there is general and there is specific, and it depends upon where in a training phase something's going to fall. But even the general has to somewhat be specific to what the overreaching goal is.
So it has to be going towards that direction.
Yeah. So is it necessary? Is it specific? Is it safe? And there's a borderline with that, depending upon the skill set and the type of athlete that there is. But there's a risk assessment with everything that you're going to do. It doesn't have to be with everything you have to do. It shouldn't be, okay, this actually, there should be a wash on most of the things, that this is relatively very safe to do. These things here may not be the safest thing. Are they necessary? Are they specific? So it's kind of working up that chain from that standpoint. Is it effective? Is it going to have the correspondence that you're looking for? So even if it's general physical preparedness, is this going to actually help with their ability to recover, with the resting heart rate, with all the things that you're trying to work there? Is it effective from that standpoint? Is it effective from the dynamic correspondence? What will carry over?
Right. Yeah.
Because if it's not going to be effective, it doesn't matter if it's safe. It doesn't matter if it's necessary. It doesn't matter if because it's actually at that point, it's not necessary. It's just throwing it in there. Compliance. Are you going to have compliance with that? So you can put something out there, and if they're not going to do it, who cares? And there's always going to be a floating level of compliance. So some of that can be adjusted by how you coach it, how you lay it out, how you plan it out. But you can tell pretty quick if you're working with somebody if it's going to be compliant or not. And if it's not going to be compliant, you need to be able to find something that will be. There's always more paths to go than just the one.
Yeah.
The skill set level and acquisition. So what is their skill set level? So go back to Juji, because I knew one of the movements was going to be some type of deficit. I didn't know what type of deficit it's going to be. Did he have the flexibility to do a deficit without putting his back in a compromised position? Did he have the ability to do the deficit that's going to actually work the muscles that I wanted to be able to work? Does he have the ability to do the deficit deadlift that's not going to become a full stiff leg deadlift? Does he know how to deadlift? Well, then once he knows those things, what will be the skill acquisition? Will he get better at that because he's just going to get better at doing that movement? Where with him, it's going to be a slower process with that because he's done it before. The technique's pretty solid with that. So he's not going to technically get that much more proficient at doing that. He'll have some neural capabilities that are going to be developed over a period of time that will make him better. But then it's going to be a movement that's going to be purely based on the progression of what that is. Is the movement something that has regression ability as well? So if it's a deficit deadlift, what if they can't do the deficit deadlift because of the things that I said, but you feel that's a super important exercise to do? How can you regress that? Is that a movement that has the ability to be regressed? And how? That's one that I'm sure there are, but it really doesn't, because the same positions, so that wouldn't be a good movement if that person was really, really, really going to suck at that, and you have to build them up to that, because the only way to build them up to that is to teach them how to be proficient at a deadlift, teach them how to be, if they can't do that, teach them how to be proficient in SS yoke bar squat with a deadlift position, teach them how to be, so it can keep regressing from there. Time demands. How much time can be devoted in this, because you can't prescribe something. So there's that. Then there's going to be support. What kind of support is around them? Is this something that they're going to need spotters? Is it something that's, usually when there's a lack of support, there's an increase of stress. So you got to take that.
That's a really good point.
You got to take that in consideration too. And the other one that falls in there is the financial means. So is there going to be a financial commitment associated to this? Either it's a coaching cost, or if it's equipment cost, or if it's gym dues, whatever it's going to be, time they have to take off work. What are those financial demands? Because once again, if it's not something that's within that wheelhouse, it's going to create stress. Everything with training comes down to recovery and stress. So you got to stimulate, then you got to be able to allow that to recover. So if these are overreaching questions with everything that I'm looking at, as I'm doing an audit. So when I'm looking through his training for the past 3 years, these questions are going through my mind with what I'm seeing. Is this necessary? Is this specific? All these type of things, because whatever I suggest, if it goes against more than a couple of those things, it's not going to work.
Yeah, can't go in.
No, it's just going to lead to injury and everything else. So that's where it's part of an analysis. So most people will know a health history analysis, which that's important to know to a point. I mean, if you're just consulting with somebody, you need to know a little bit, but you don't need to know everything.
Right.
If you're actually training them, let's say you're doing any heart rate monitoring type thing, and they're on blood pressure meds, or they're on any medication that's going to control heart rate, you kind of need to know that. Otherwise, you're going to be trying to prescribe, different heart rate training zones, and good luck with that.
Right.
Because it's just not going to be able to happen. You also need to know injury history. You need to know reoccurring injury history. He had some things with his knees. He had some, just most of them seem to be related to overuse and the tricking type things. He didn't seem to have a whole lot of injuries that were resulted from training, which was good. But at the same time, being an influencer, and usually people do not put a lot of their training related injuries online.
Right.
So you need to ask about that. The only ones that really put those online are like bodybuilders, because it's a bragging thing. Or not bodybuilders, but powerlifters, because it's
Just
a bragging
something purple.
thing. Yeah, it's just always on there. So with the needs analysis, there's a lot of things that I put in there that most people don't think about. Nutrition and hydration are questions I want to know about, because it's very low hanging fruit. Juji wasn't going to be an issue with the nutrition, obviously, because the calorie surplus from the increase in muscle mass. I did ask him how much weight he was up. So that is a real easy way to figure out, are they in a calorie deficit or are they a calorie surplus? They're gaining weight, obviously they're in calorie surplus, but hydration can still be, a factor with that. With the needs analysis, there's also the sport analysis and the position analysis, which some of that I spoke about already as I was going through with Juji on all these different things. So a lot of these analysis and a lot of this assessment can be done now online, because people like him, they're posting all their stuff.
Right.
If
the data
not,
is there.
Yes, and you can even see a lot of movement just based on the online stuff as well. So it's all there. So it's taking all that, and then what's the underlying question is, here's this deadlift, we wouldn't try to be able to help that, but how's that fit? Right? Because there's a lot of global things that are moving at the same time, and it has to work with those. It can't work against those. So if I was to say, okay, I'm going to treat this just like a power lifter. They come in, they want to pull 700 pounds, they just power lift, and I'm going to be the dickhead, and I'm going to tell him, look, stop everything that you're doing. Just focus on the deadlift for 3 or 4 months. Quit all this other shit. Stop all the other training that's unnecessary. I guarantee you pull 700 pounds, but that's not his sport. That's not his sport demands. That's not his training goals. That would be the same thing as me telling a fullback or a running back in the NFL, stop everything you're doing so we can build your squat.
Right.
That's not programming.
No.
It's not looking at it from a global perspective.
And it's funny because, for most people, they'd be like, "Oh, Dave fixes deadlift." And the deadlift wasn't even part of the first 15 minutes, 20 minutes of this conversation, because it may look like the goal, but the goal is to get them to a better position in what they're doing, right? Because he's an athlete, but he's also a businessman. He's got so many of these stressors, and you had mentioned on it how it's about stress and recovery, right? If you don't take into account all of the other things that he does, the travel, the this, the that, you're not going to find success. And I think that's the biggest takeaway I think that everybody can kind of take is, if you're a coach or a trainer, take the time to make the assessment a major part of what you do with a client. Don't just start.
It's everything.
Right.
That's the hardest. That's the most work. That's probably, I don't know how long. I mean, because I had to look to find a lot of these things too. And there's podcasts that you're listening to. It's probably 15, 20 hours of just listening to shit. Now, I would say out of all that, I probably, if I would have just called him and said, hey, look,
right.
I probably could have drilled that way down, but I don't do that. I just drill into that. But it falls down to, I want to see him pull 700 pounds. If I do. I do.
Yeah.
You know, so if I'm not putting, you know, everything that I have into being able to help him pull the 700 pounds to be able to lay it out, then I'm failing myself. I'm not failing him.
Right.
You know, because then, now if he doesn't use any of it, that's fine. You know, that's good. But if he uses, I don't expect him to use all of it. I don't. I just expect him to think through the process the way that I'm thinking through the process. Because if I'm working with anybody, if it's out here or not, my goal is to teach them how to teach themselves.
That's huge.
Because I can't be in their head.
Yeah.
So when they walk, if they have pain every now and again in their foot or their back, I don't know that. And if you ask them 3 days later, how do you feel? They're going to forget that. They have to be able to know how to do that. And if I can't do that, then I'm failing at what I do, failing at a craft or whatever you want to call it. I'm not coaching. I'm just programming. And fuck, anybody can do that. You can buy those for fucking $10 a week. You can get them for free on our website. Anybody can do that. That's not coaching. It's not coaching at all. And that's where I can go on a rant about that. People can say they're an online coach. Well, I don't give a fuck what you want to call yourself, but it's not coaching. It just simply isn't, because there's no interpersonal dynamic. There's no
relationship.
Yes,
right?
There's not. No, I mean, you got to figure all this shit out and know how to do that. So look, the other piece of this is when I look at other coaches and consult with other coaches, one of the biggest missing factors that I'm seeing, and it's more and more as the years go by, is they're not thinking of annual plans. They're not thinking of quadrennials. So if you want to use the technical terms, they're not thinking of, let me go to my list.
Pull it up.
Pull my list. Well, there's different, and I understand where the confusion comes in, right? Because you got macro cycles, which is going to be whatever the longest term plan is. It could be quadrennial, it could be a year. And then there's mesocycles, which are basically blocks. Okay, I'm going to start to explain why people get confused with all those. Then you have the microcycles and you have a training day. Okay, so let's start with the macro cycle. A lot of people like to use macro cycle because it sounds smart, right? It's an annual fucking plan, or it's a quadrennial, 4-year plan. It's training for the next big event, right? The next big event isn't going to be the first game of the season. The next big event could be the season, or it could be, you know, the last game of the season, the championships, or whatever it's going to, it could be, if it's a track thing, the nationals. You know, that's the big thing. And that's usually will happen, if it's a power lifter, it's going to be the biggest meet of the year. Maybe there's 2. It's a little weird now in the sport. That's got to be what's in mind. So when you think of programming globally, how do you get from one to the next to the next to the next? So let's say over a 4-year plan, the reason it's quadrennial is because of Olympic cycles, and that's kind of how the Olympic coaches are going to lay these things out. Because if you got to qualify for the Olympics in year 3, then where do they need to be in year 2? Where do they need to be in year 1? Where are they now? Then how do you progress through there? You're not trying to qualify them in year 1.
No.
Right?
And I think a lot of people, I imagine there's a lot of listeners and viewers that are kind of blown away with the fact that you start the process a year out.
Easy.
They're thinking Monday.
Well, yeah, they're thinking Monday. I mean, a lot of the times if I'm working with somebody, I'm looking past that.
Right.
So many times, I mean, it's powerlifters many times. So many times you got to, and here's a great example of it. It's somebody I've been working with out here, is you got to have realistic expectations, but you can't give the realistic expectation on day 1, right? So the realistic expectation is, say he has the end of the year, so December, mid-December, right around that time is when the biggest meet of the year is going to be. That's when we want the highest output. That's when we want the greatest result. I have to get the focus there. I don't have to get the focus on the meet that's 12 weeks out, which will be like a comeback meet.
Yeah.
Right? So I can't have that conversation until I've developed the trust, you know, because they have to know that you kind of know what you're doing. I can't do that until I have them to have trust in themselves. And so when after 3-4 weeks, whatever time it's going to take, then you're having the conversation of showing them, you know, laying out that whole the fucking macro cycle. See, I try to not use the words because I don't want to confuse people. I want to say annual plan.
Yep.
So I'm trying to lay out this annual plan on a dry erase board so now they can see, okay, if we peak for this in August, when you want this, when that first one is, that leaves us 12 weeks until December. So how are we going to do this? How are we going to peak for this, turn it around, and then peak again 12 weeks later?
And be at the actual peak at your the more important.
So how's this going to work now?
Right.
You know, help me understand how we're going to be able to deload the last 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks for some of the lifts, do the meet, and then have basically a week off after that, and then do some reconstruction the week after that. So we're going to take 5 weeks off essentially in the middle to be able to hit this one peak that really doesn't matter, because that's just like a comeback thing. And then we're going to compromise the end result here. So when you're thinking one meet at a time, 1 week at a time, you're always compromising the end result. If you don't think of the end result, then you're already fucking up, because you should always begin with the end in mind, right? So if that's the issue, and that issue could be being 30 pounds lighter, it could be adding 15 pounds of muscle mass, it could be adding, 100 pounds on the squat, 100 pounds on the bench. You keep going after it in these low-hanging time frames, you're always jeopardizing the long-term strategy, because with any strategy, if it's business, training, whatever it is, there's a short-term strategy, and there's a medium-term strategy, and there's a long-term strategy.
They all have to line
oh
up.
Shit, that's a microcycle, a macrocycle, and a mesocycle.
Yep.
So let's just call it what they are. It can be an annual plan. Mesocycles are also called blocks. The reason I wrote this down is because when you start looking at different mesocycles, so this is where people get confused. If you're reading straight block training, you're going to have accumulations, you're going to have transmutation, you're going to have realization, right? With linear, you're going to have conditioning or hypertrophy, strength, peak. With, then you can get into preparatory phases, competition phases, shock phases, pre-competition, recovery, transition, hypertrophy, strength, speed, strength. All these are different blocks that serve different purposes. They're all called different things depending upon who the author is. Some authors just make shit up to make it look like they stand out more than what other people do. The parameters of each one of these blocks is always going to evolve around intensity, which is load of 1 rep max, effort, which is in RPE, basically how hard they're training, volume, which is sets and reps, and then some type of rest period. Everything centers around that. So take the fucking name off of it, and how you're going to manipulate those 4 variables within each one of these training blocks, months, 3-week phases, whatever you want to call it. How are you going to manipulate those to work toward that end goal of whatever's at the end of the year? So I did a video a while ago on how to squat 500 pounds by the end of the year, and basically just laid this out in a meathead style. Like, okay, here's this. Where do you need to be to run that last 3 blocks, which could be a competitive, cycles or whatever it is. You're going to have the strength, you're going to have a peak, you're going to have, whatever they want to call it. Accumulation, realization, whatever you're going to have, right? And then you're going to have the off season. It could be an off season. It could be called conditioning. It could be called training to get ready to train. People call it a lot of different things. But each one of these phases, blocks, mesocycles, they're all the same concept. They're all manipulating those variables for whatever the desired outcome is for that. So the biggest mistake is people aren't understanding this process. So they're trying to stack together a strength block, 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 a strength block. Then they end up overreaching, overtraining, or getting hurt. Or they start laying things out and they forget certain blocks that need to go in there. So say after a realization block, peak block, whatever you want to call that, max out block, whatever it is. After that, they don't have a recovery in there.
Just go right into the next.
And they're like, well, hell, maybe I can get this next one.
Yeah.
Right? And then boom, they end up falling apart.
And I think just remembering that it all boils down to adaptation, right? Like it's what you're trying to adapt to, right? If you're constantly in a high stress environment, your body is going to adapt potentially, if you do it for too long, negatively.
Yes, well, it's going to adapt, but it's going to have the adaptation stimulus. Then how long will that stimulus be maintained?
Yep.
Right? And then that adaptation stimulus is going to need a recovery stimulus. So if you're an idiot like me, you'll go through a peak stimulus, peak on that, and then start trying to take out other low-hanging fruit and not realize that, well, you realize you just don't. You don't put in the recovery stimulus and then pow. because that peak can't be maintained for as long as what people think it is, especially at the highest levels. When you peak it to the highest levels, it's going to last shorter. When you peak it, let's say you just wanted to peak it at a 90%, then it's going to last a little bit longer. You peak it to that 110%, 105%. Over that, it's not going to last as long. You need to hit it, get out of it. It's fast, but you can't completely stop, because then you're going to end up being more fucked up, because it's going to go the other way. So with each one of these phases, blocks, mesocycles, how long are the abilities that you're developing going to maintain, and what needs to be done to maintain those longer? So if it's a conditioning or a hypertrophy block that's going in there, how long will that person maintain muscle mass before it's going to start to lose? So if they're typically doing repetitions in say a 10 to 15 range for all movements, building muscle, building hypertrophy, putting the nutrients in to create that, which is a factor. Because if you're going to go through a block like that for hypertrophy, then you're not going to feed it and you're not going to hydrate it. Then there's no point. That goes back to the nutritional analysis from the very beginning. So that goes back to that first analysis of the whole process, because you can essentially end up taking something that you want to be a hypertrophy block, and it ends up just being a recovery block, because you're not feeding the system to be able to do the adaptations that you want on that. So with those in there, now you go into that next block. How long will that last? What nutritionally has to happen to be able to maintain that? And is there compliance in the fact that they know they're probably not going to add more muscle mass as they go through that next phase that's going to deal with strictly maybe 5s or maybe 3s. So it's in a different range. So it goes back to the coaching again. It can be maintained, but different motor abilities are going to be maintained at different rates.
Right.
So maximal strength isn't going to be maintained as long. Now we can get into a whole conversation about conjugate, which is the ability to try to move everything at the same time, which is where my bias pretty falls, because it takes some of this out, but it also makes it very hard to drive any one singular one of these.
Right, you're raising everything up a little bit, but you're never going to get the peak of a peak.
Yes, and the conjugate is still a style of periodization.
Sure.
That as you get to a peak, a lot of the other things are going to change to be able to maximize that. So it's a different conversation, but it's one that doesn't go down this path. That becomes more complicated when trying to explain these concepts to people when you throw that out. Because why not just do it all at the same time? I don't disagree, but let's just figure out what they are first.
Right.
Because you want to throw everything and do everything at the same time, but you don't understand the motor abilities that you're trying to develop.
Yeah, they
the
don't get
skill
the goal.
sets.
Yeah.
And how those have to be developed before you start combining. If you can't understand how to develop them
Just
independently,
doing more of that
right,
would not be beneficial.
then how the hell are you going to develop them when you throw them all together? So that kind of goes into there, and that's before we get into how to go through and progress each one of these cycles.
And it's funny because, and again, I'm sure we're going to go into it as well. This again, all of these spinning plates, all of these different things that you kind of need to, if you're a coach, if you were actually coaching and training somebody, you need to write this stuff down. You need to organize this information. You need to be up to date with everything you're doing. Like every training cycle, every training block, every training day, needs to have that data and information, because that's our job as the coach. Our job is to be able to wrangle this information, dissect it, and put it for our client or our athlete or whoever in a way that they can understand and that they can utilize and then continue to grow.
Yeah, at least know what you're trying to develop at the time you're trying to develop it.
Right.
Not just we want to get stronger.
It's like, oh, we're squatting today. It's like,
Yeah, I mean, that's just kind of like common sense, Now,
not so common sense.
yeah, but here's the thing, though. They wouldn't develop the skills necessary for their sport the same way. So if it's a wrestler and you're trying to teach takedown moves, for the large part, you can't start to begin to teach those takedown moves until they know how to do a drop step, right? So do they know how to stand? There's things that have to happen before basics, right? So there's programming basics, right? And within, I just said this to somebody because I had to send a text out earlier to make sure what I'm going to say here in a minute is still true. But within basics, there's a base, right? So a lot of people today doing the programming are so caught up in different certifications that are out there, and there's hundreds of certifications that are out there, and I'm not bashing the certifications because they all kind of I understand. I don't like the word certification, I guess I will say that, but I can't bash them because there's thousands of them. Hell, there's probably even more than that. Now there's a certification for everything, and I understand that.
You could probably find a certification on how to create a certification.
There are. And so there are. I've seen it.
I believe it.
So there are. And they have a purpose. They have a point. But they're not all created the same, which is a conversation for another day. They're not. Mm-hmm. So some of them are just fucking rip-offs. Some of them are nothing more than a seminar that they call a certification just so they can charge $500 or $600 more. I would say that's the majority of all of them. So they're basically just that. Anyhow, people get so caught up into that accumulation of the certifications and not thinking about what is the base knowledge that they have to know, because most of the certifications that I see are building upon that base. So if you don't understand the basic principles associated with periodization, even if it's just linear periodization, before the block and all this, so the things that I'm talking about, if you don't even understand the base, right? And every one of these certifications that I see that are actually worth a shit all stress the importance of everything comes from the base. Mm-hmm. Everything comes from the core. Everything comes from foundation. Everything comes from internal stability. Everything comes from the base. Mm-hmm. And this is all of them. But they fail to say that the real base is understanding programming. Because you can take all the stuff that they have, which is basically just accessories that you're going to put on the car, and your engine doesn't run because it's not put in there. So the base, and the reason why I said I had to send a text out is the NSCA through their CSCS, when I've been associated, I'm not associated anymore, but I was for 30 fucking years. I think I got my CSCS in 90 or 89 or something. It was a long fucking time ago.
I was born then.
Yeah. So yes. So a long time ago is when I got that. And I learned a lot of the basics. I already kind of knew the linear stuff, but I learned all that through there, which is the basics. I've sent texts out this morning to see if they still have that in there. Full disclosure, I'm no longer a CSCS because I don't want to do it. I accumulate enough. When Mark Watts worked for us, I went through and I went back through the years and put in all the shit that I do from speaking, writing, and all the other stuff. And I think you're good. I'm still good, right? So there's no reason for me to have the CSCS. It just doesn't make any difference with that. But I will promote the shit out of the CSCS because it teaches the basics. And right now, that's what fucking people don't know. So when I'm speaking with or consulting to them with people now, I have to go back and explain some of the concepts that we're talking about earlier in more detail because they don't have a clue. And it's like, what the fuck? They have 7 certifications through, all these different bodies, and you don't know the basics of how programming works. And to me, it's kind of ridiculous. So get the CSCS and here's the fault that here's the fault that many of the certification bodies and all the other bodies are going to say about that. Don't get that. It's a waste of your money. It's just too basic. Well, God damn it, your people don't know the basics and you're not teaching them.
Right.
So either go back and start teaching the basics as 3 or 4 hours as part of what your training is with your certification, or shut the fuck up and tell them that they should probably get this. I have no affiliation with them. I get no money from them. I'm not even certified by them anymore. I just want people to learn the basics, and we got a website full of it as well. There's other people online that do a really good job of teaching a lot of the basics. But what intimidates people with this is that everybody loves fast and easy. They love microcycles. They love mesocycles because you're talking a week period. Hey, what's your training week look like? What's your split look like? Most popular questions, right? How do you break up your body parts
right now?
You know, how do you break this up? What's your split? What's this? What's this? Simple questions because they don't want to think more than a week. Or, hey, what's the best program to do to peak for a meet? 12 weeks. Nobody fucking talks about, hey, how should I lay this out over an annual plan? Let's just say you want to do the meet, right? Well, what are you going to do afterwards to get ready for the next one if you like it? Okay, now we just went from 12 weeks to maybe another 10 weeks in the off-season type stuff into another 12 weeks. So you just add another 22, 23 weeks on top of the 12 that you just did. How many weeks is that? It's about a fucking year.
Yeah.
You know, it's about an annual plan, but I don't want to think about that. Well, you're a dumbass. You don't care that much about trying to make your training better, assuming that you're intermediate or above, or you don't care enough as a coach about your clients to even learn how to make them get better. So that kind of where that falls there.
Yeah, and it's
and
fun.
I guess to go back to real quick before we get into the next question.
Yeah.
Juji obviously does this, right? Because he's not promoting it. He's not saying it. I think he does have books about stuff. I haven't seen them, but he is actually doing this. You know how I know it? Because I saw it. When doing the audit, I see it in his structure. So you see it there, you know.
And he is. I actually saw him post up the other day. He was doing his deficits in his gym, so it was good. Yeah, no, and this is one of those conversations that I think is so important for coaches and trainers and anybody, and athletes, anybody to really start to look at their own training, right? Start to look at their own process, start to look at their own coach they're working with or whatever, and start to take that ownership for their performance and start to have that autonomy. And you had mentioned that earlier, was you're trying to create that autonomy with your client's ability to essentially teach themselves over the course of time.
They have to.
They have to. You have to educate them.
To me, they have to, because I don't want to sit there and have to explain all this shit.
Right.
I mean, the secret, I guess, with people that train out here is I've gone through the route of trying to write everything and do all that stuff for them, and it doesn't work as well as if I see them. If I see them each week, I can give recommendations and I can bounce them off people that are friends of mine that have been here for 20 years to validate or have other ideas different than what I see. So I don't charge anybody to come out here, but at the same time, if they're not consistent, I don't want them here because then I'm vesting interest and time into something that's going to have no return and have absolutely no value whatsoever. And if they can't help us, so that's part of the process is your work. They still have to do their things during the week. So you have to be able to give the suggestions, but they have to learn how to gauge. This is part of this process, how and what they're doing during the week, because they're going to be asked about it on the weekend, or they're going to be assessed when they walk through the door, how they look, where the training state is, and all that, to be able to know where they are, which is going to determine the changes that are going on here. Overall, in my head, I know a lot of the plan as far as where it's going to go, but I'm only going to share as much as needs to be shared because you're trying to teach them. So if you data dump all this crap on them, the compliance drops. So it's not going to be there. And so that's the biggest thing with that compliance part is they have to, this is basically what I'm trying to say is they're taking ownership of the program, because the big part of that ownership of the program is the consistency, because it doesn't matter. You got to nail the consistency first before anything. And so the effort, and it's not just me, it's probably the effort any coach is going to put into it. The effort anybody is going to put into a person is going to 100% be based upon that consistency. Not consistent, it's not worth putting the effort and thought into, because it's just wasted time. You got your own stuff to be able to do. More consistent, more thought. So it's kind of an earned, this may be a little bit of an old school thing. It's kind of an earned thing, unless they want to pay. They want to pay, then they're going to pay for the time it's a lot of fucking time that you just don't want to do. But then that's still not going to yield the highest return because they're never going to learn, how to manipulate the variables So the mental aspect, again, it goes to the physical, mental, and the technical. And everybody wants to jump to the physical for any weak point or any structure of training. Everybody. I mean, I can even probably say this is why there's such a growing demand on, I don't know what they call it now, but years ago it was the functional training, and then it was, Paul Chek had his thing. I mean, there's different iterations every 5 years of different type things that deal with all that. It's all movement based, I guess would be what it is. It's all movement based because everybody wants to go immediately to the physical. Immediately, what do I need to do to get better? Right? And that's one aspect, right? They don't want to drill down into maybe your technique on all your other movements sucks, and then that's what's creating the problem here. But by the way, do this, to fix this problem here. But we're not going to address all the shit that you're doing outside of there, that's actually creating the problem.
Yeah.
So we're not going to get to the root of the problem. We're just going to put the Band-Aid on this because it looks cool. We can use big words and we can impress the shit out of you, and we can get compliance for a couple weeks while you do these, rehab exercises, post-rehab, whatever you want to call it. And they have their place in rehab, post-rehab and so forth. But so let's take that away. That still comes down to, hey, what do I need to do to increase the lockout on my bench? You think pin presses are good or board presses, or do I need to do more close grip work? Well, fuck,
It's kind of a loaded question.
Are you hurt? Does your technique suck? Have you ever thought about what happens if you got faster going into that mini max or that sticking point? Because maybe that bumps it. Maybe that crushes through the sticking point. But let's say it doesn't crush through the sticking point, but it moves it from 5 inches off your chest to 6. But hey, you were asking me about pin presses and board presses. So what position? Well, are you willing to do the speed work to bump it up to where it's going to be a 3 board, or do you just want to just use a 2 board and just teach yourself to go into that sticking point even slower? So,
yeah, and it really is one of those things that as a coach is that communication. Obviously, like it's that back and forth. And one of the things that I've found in my own personal working with clients and athletes and whatnot is your ability to articulate these concepts and your ability to understand the information coming in from that person. Like you had mentioned earlier, like the nonverbals, right? Being able to see people in person, understanding their habits, understanding everything that's going on. I think that mental component, but also that humanistic component of being able to have a conversation, right? I think for coaches and trainers, it's easier and safer for them to get lost in the minutia of the numbers, because numbers are safe, numbers are binary. It's like this is this phase, this is this, but you have to have that human component, that interaction back and forth to bring that to life.
Well, part of one of the things I left out on my programming notes, see if I can be able to see this without my glasses, is the coach's ability. You have to assess your coaching ability. So you got the needs assessment, all the other things we talked about, the different training parameters, but then there's a coach's assessment. So what's your own ability? What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? What are the things that you need to farm out? What are the things that and what's the backup plan? So if this is a weakness of yours, who do you go to be able to get the answer? Because sometimes all you need is the answer, like, hey, look, what can I do in this situation? A, B, and C. They tell you, you implement it, you go. You don't really need to farm that out. But you need to have the network of people to put in there. The third component of that, you got strengths, you got weaknesses, your bias, right? So what is your bias and how strong is it? And then when you're communicating with somebody, are you asking yourself, is this in the best interest of them, or is this in the convenience of me? Right? Because the convenience of me is always going to be where your bias lies. Now, if you've seen it 1,000 times and it's worked to fix it, say 800 times, that's going to have that's validated. It's fine. But a lot of times you get lost in the minutia of your bias because you want to be right. Being right doesn't make the person better.
Feels good though, right? You know what I mean?
Does it though?
Right.
Does it though? Because when they go to compete or when they don't reach their goal
based on a bias,
you have two choices as a coach. You blame them or you blame you. But the fact of the matter is, if it's somebody that you're working with and they don't perform to the ability that they should perform, it's always you.
Mm-hmm.
You're the person behind the curtain. You're the person on the sidelines. You're the person that's back in the gym while they're doing what they have to do.
Mm-hmm.
You're accountable and responsible for that, right? So take responsibility, of that. You can cast, and yes, did they fuck up? Did they choke? Whatever it is. Maybe yes, maybe yes, maybe yes. Did you prepare them for that?
Right. There's always that level of responsibility regardless of the outcome.
Always.
You need to take on yourself.
Always.
Right?
So now if that's because of a strong bias, then it's probably time to move the athlete along to somebody else, because obviously your bias or your program isn't working. Are you okay with programming something that's completely against what your bias is? Some people are. Some people are so tied to their bias financially that they probably do need to just move the person to somebody else, because it takes a lot of work and a lot of effort, to be able to do that. And sometimes that bias can be based upon a team program, to where that's going to create other issues, because you can't change everything for one person. So then how's the program set? What's the backup plan? So with each one of those variables that I listed earlier, from the coaching, needs analysis, and all that, what's the backup plan for all that? Because if you have the outlier, up top or below, what's the backup plan to be able to address those? Is it an assistant? Is it somebody else? Is it just a general program, just general recommendations to be able to, what is that plan? Is it, kick them out, get them out, whatever it's going to be, what is that? Because that needs to be addressed in there as well.
Yeah, and I think we'll start kind of shifting gears here a little bit and kind of talking more nuts and bolts in terms of, you had mentioned volume, you had mentioned intensity, you'd mentioned effort, you mentioned recovery. I think if we can kind of start to give the coaches and athletes here a little bit more of a breakdown of looking at a program and how do we kind of structure it? Like, what are we looking, obviously it's a loaded question, but in terms of main movements, accessories, volume, that's kind of like landmarks. I know we had talked about landmarks with Phil the other day on the podcast, and he did a great job kind of going over some of his landmarks for his athletes. And of course, it's going to change based on the sport, based on if you have a room full of athletes versus one person versus, but I think just kind of general guidelines that people could kind of take home and utilize and use it as almost a lens to look at their own training, to be like, okay, how does what I'm doing now stack up to what I could be doing?
Yes.
So they can kind of understand.
So I would call those, I use the same definition in business. My cord's wrapped, there it goes. It's wrapped around my chair. I use the same, I'm losing my headphones here and there. Okay, it's all right. In business, what's your key performance indicators, KPIs? So you're going to have essential KPIs. Then you're going to have KPIs that maybe, I don't want to say non-essential, but aren't as essential, aren't as important. So obviously, say in business, an essential KPI is cash flow.
Yeah.
Right. So if cash flow is 0, you're kind of fucked. But then again, falling back on what I said before, what's the backup plan? Do you have a credit line? You need to have, somewhere you can go when the bucket hits 0, to where you can be able to go, because you have no backup plan, then you're done. Right. So there needs to be backup plan for everything. So you got the key performance indicators. So that should be part of the needs analysis as well, because before this is even laid out and even structured, the phases laid out, the blocks laid out, whatever you want to call that, what's going to gauge the success of this program? What are the KPIs? So even if it's a personal training client, there can be KPIs. It can be number of push-ups. What are they? And they can't be a huge list, because then those are just exercises. They're just performance. They're just getting better at things, which is the whole point of fucking training. So you should get better at things, but the big things need to be determined. So the way that I lay that out with coaches is, powerlifters, it's simple. Squat, bench, deadlift. Weightlifters, it's simple. There's, I can even say to a certain extent, bodybuilding is simple, because you're going to have lean body mass, and how you look, but that's subjective. So subjectivity becomes an issue. right? Because you're not in control of that.
It goes with the bias as well.
Yeah, yes. So yes, but you have, objective lenses that you can look in.
Mm-hmm.
And in bodybuilding, there may be certain lifts done in certain intensity zones, 8 to 10, that may be indicators, maybe not. That would be a discussion. That's part of the dialogue you're having with the person. So if you're speaking to them and you just throw questions out like, what are these lifts? I squat this much. Well, say they squat 405 for 10 and their leg is 24 inches. I'm just throwing shit out there. So then I'll ask them, well, what was the leg size when you squat at 315? Because if it was 24 inches and now you're squatting 405, then maybe something has to change. Maybe not the exercise, but the style in which the exercise is being done has to change. So this becomes a little more vast. But if I'm consulting with coaches, this is where there is some subjectivity in here. Because what I'm going to ask them is, if you only had 5 or 6 different things that you could increase in your team, what are those things that have dynamic correspondence, which is basically just saying carryover? I'll try to start saying carryover to the field. What are they? So they'll start throwing things out. So this would be the conversation that I'm having. Squat. Okay, what type of squat? Front squat, box squat, back squat, high bar, low bar. What type of squat? And if there's hesitancy, I'm going to say, are you sure? See what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because I want to validate everything that they're saying so they're not shooting from the hip. And then usually a squat is in there, right? So sometimes it's going to vary depending upon the coach. I want them to tell me what they've seen, right? They've worked with 500-600 high school athletes. They already know what works and what doesn't work. I just have to pull it.
Yep.
All right, so I want to know what that is. Then if it's a bench press, what type of bench press? What grip? Are you sure? Most of the time that ends up being, no, I'm not.
And you can even ask, is there a situation where that wasn't the case?
Well, that can be an outlier,
Right.
So what percentage of the time might be better?
Yep.
Because you're always going to have outliers, because people can always circle back and say, well, I remember having this lineman that could bench 500 pounds. And man, he sucked. He couldn't play for shit. Okay, that's an outlier. So what are the other ones? So you start going through that, but you got to open the discussion a little bit and say, what about a flying 10? What about a T drill? What about a 40? What about a 20? What about just a 10? What are these other variables that you can put in there? Do those have, then you start laying them out. Those become the key performance indicators. Those become the drivers of the program. Those become, okay, we want to increase these because we already know, because you told me, we already know these have the dynamic correspondence. So let's focus on what we have to do to drive these 5, 6 indicators. So all the rest of the programming that we do for the whole year needs to be focused around that, for that part of the program. There's different parts we'll talk about at training day. Anything that doesn't drive those, it's a waste of time.
Yep.
So if you're going to tell me 3 months from now, hey, somebody told me the walking lunge is great for football players. Well, does that increase your box squat? Does that increase this? Does that increase your clean? Does that increase this? No, fuck you. It ain't going in. Right? I'm not saying that it's not good.
No.
But it's not part of this plan. It's not part of this philosophy. As soon as you start drifting off course, you're failing. So that's where those come in. Personal training clients, it depends upon the level. Right, but that's where you got to start looking more at regressions than progressions, because let's say it's a bench press. Some people can't do bench presses, so then is it like hex dumbbell push-ups? It's push-ups are good. Push-ups are fine. It's probably a good place to start, but the force going through the full hand isn't the same as a force going through a bar. So there has to be a progression to get to a fist position from that open hand position, or maybe the open hand is important. Are they slapping?
KPI slapping power.
So whatever that's going to be. So these KPIs aren't just specific to squat, bench, deadlift, those type of things. And any strength coach will tell you what these are. They might have a couple that are like wide open, and the more, the worse it is, because these are the things you're going to try to peak throughout the year. So let's say one of those is of 40. Say for some reason one of them's a mile time. I mean, sports got different things. You know, you're probably not going to try to peak your mile time and your one max squat at the same time. Oh, interesting. So you're going to have different blocks to be able to focus on these different abilities. See how this all streams
it's a trickle down effect
down, right? And this, I guess you would say, this is all part of that needs analysis as well, is establish the indicators, all these things that you need. They're rules. Everything that you establish from a needs analysis, a health history, you know, an audit of program. The audit of programs is what this is that we're talking about right now. They establish your rules, right? And your rules establish how the program is going to move. And then once you have those rules, then you have to implement. Now, how are you going to utilize those rules to the greatest advantage? You know, that's when the recovery, that's when the accumulation comes in. That's when the super compensation comes in. That's when the different loading protocols come in. That's when the different exercises come in. Compliance comes in. So when you start drilling down into the mesocycle, the month, the phase, right? So I'm trying to use every different thing here.
Yep.
You can have flat loading, you know, so, you know, old school West Side was that you just stayed with the same dynamic bench. You stayed with the same weight, really didn't change anything. Right? You just stay at the same intensity zone. For Diamond, that makes sense. But a lot of people will just stay with 80%, right? So say they're going to stay with 80% for maybe 3s or maybe 5s for a block. And that flat loading, what they're going to try to do is just become better at lifting 80% over the 4 weeks. That has a point. So when people say flat loading, that's stupid, you're using the same weight for 4 weeks. I don't disagree, but I want to know why it's that way. Because if that's training the motor ability to become better at using 80%, then that's specificity. Is it necessary as a specific? Fits. So you can have flat loading, you can have step loading, you know, 75%, 80%, you know, it steps up. Then you can have inverse, you know, 80, you know, so it goes down. You can have a wave. So it's like a pendulum that waves through there. And each one of these loading sectors, parameters, methods, there's no right and there's no wrong. So this, again, this is where training, yes, it's a science, right? There's a science behind it, but look at everything that I've said today and show me the science that shows you how all these things should be combined. Good fucking luck with that, right? Because there's an art that has to follow with all this. So what my advice would be, if you're typically always using a step loading structure for a block, have you tried a flat loading structure? If you're always have you tried an inverse? Have you tried a wave? You know, because it's not like you don't have a lot of different blocks to be able to experiment with this, because you're dealing with different intensity zones. So that's how it can progress. But what people want to know is what's the best for that. Well, I don't know. You know, what's worked before. You know, tell me what's worked before, because we'll start there. If you don't know, then I'm probably going to start with the step loading, because typically that's what most people are accustomed to and most people can relate to, and most people are going to have higher compliance with. So I lift this week, I lift a little more next week, I lift more, I like that. You know, there's going to be higher compliance. I lift this week, then less next week, and then less the next week.
Right.
Right? Now, you can sit there and try to explain, well, what we're going to try to do is to increase the force output of each one of those.
You're matching it with the personality of the person that you're working with as well, right? Like if they're like a hard charger go-getter, it's like you have to take that into consideration when programming. Whether or not the textbook says one thing for this specific sport, specific time of year, this, that, and the other thing, there needs to be that variance for who you're actually working with.
And what are you going to do when they become accumulated to a step loading pattern? Keep doing it.
Yeah, just keep throwing.
You know, because then it has to change.
Yeah.
So that would be. And now this changes too based upon where in the training day, because there's another variable that we haven't discussed, which is the actual training day. So you have the microcycle week. And the reason why microcycles get used a lot of the times, a lot of people use an 8-day week. You know, so it's 4 training days or a 9-day. So 4 training days, 1 day off, 4 training days. So then it ends up being a 9-day. You can say a 9-day week, which actually most people are going to probably have more buy-in and understand. Or you can say microcycle, which is confusing people, makes you look smart. So what's the what's the
right.
What's the end result? Making them better. So communication is going to be vital with that. Now in the training day, that can also be set up a lot of different ways. So that can be set up with a top-down program, to where the loading is going to be heaviest at the beginning, and then the load intensity. I should probably pause and say intensity and effort are essentially the same thing in my book. I just define them two different ways, because if you're speaking powerlifting, you're talking percentage of 1 rep max. If you're speaking bodybuilding, you're speaking more like RPE, how hard they're working, which is very subjective, right? And but both have their pros and cons. But when you're trying to interchange, here's a 90% double with here's doing a leg press to absolute failure in a 10 to 15 rep range. Yes, those are training completely different abilities, but the output and the effort and the ability to recover kind of to me, they're along the same lines. There are differences, but they're both hard to recover from.
Right.
So if you break recovery down into easy, medium, hard, right? The simplest form, those are both hard. So you have like a top-down approach where it will be like a main exercise, supplemental exercise, accessory exercise, so forth. Then you'll have, weak point approach. You're going to put all the weakest stuff first and then build off of there. Then you're going to have technical efficiency approach. What are they best at? Let's put that first. What are they worst at? Let's put that
skill
first.
Component.
Let's put, or it can be explosive to slow, to where, a lot of people want to start with dynamic work first and then move it down to the slow work. So there's evidence to support all of these. And I don't care about any of that. I still care about compliance, right? Because however that training day is going to be laid out is good. Well, let's go back to the loading again. That first exercise, if it's a main exercise, core movement, max effort exercise, dynamic exercise, the squat, bench, deadlift, heavy exercise, how's that going to be loaded and how's that going to be waved throughout that block? Inverse, just the things I talked about, step loading, flat loading, inverse, declining, wave. How's that going to be done? This is where people get screwed up with periodization, because then they assume, okay, the second exercise has to follow the same suit. The third exercise has to follow the same suit. We're moving from intensity zones. So that first exercise, if it's, heavy to light, is probably working in a hard training zone, a mentally taxing training zone. They have to be aware, they have to be competent, they have to be focused on what they're doing. The second one's going to be a little bit lighter. The reps are typically going to go up. So now how that going to wave? And then how's the accessory going to wave? And as you move down to lower movements, accessory movements, side raises, tricep push down, stuff like that, how are those going to load? How are they going to change? And is it necessary? Right? Because when you get to the fourth or fifth exercise, you got fatigue management. So if you're going to wave and you're going to load a fifth exercise and you don't know the physical demands that are going to happen before that, and you think you do, we can all guess we do,
right?
But day changes, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes it could be, fuck it, just get out of here. And that's another advantage of when you have the heavy work, having somebody you're training with that can help with that, because they can see after the first exercise, look, that's good. You hit all your KPIs. This is way above your KPIs. Just get the fuck out of here.
Yeah.
Just, help the rest of the day, get out of here. You're good. And break it down that way. But I would say for the first half of the training plan, there has to be some structure behind how that's being loaded that's going to follow basic progressive overload type of guidelines, either increase in reps, increase in load, decrease in rest. There's all those variables to be able to follow with there. But the lower it falls in the training day, I don't want to say the less important.
Just the less
it is
stressful.
The less stressful, the less physically demanding. I can make a case that sometimes it's the most important, because if sometimes those movements will need to be moved to the front of the training as a warm-up, because they're always skipped and they're always not done. So that's the training day. So all these variables, the training day, week, month, year, have to be in focus with a training plan. So
And it starts with those KPIs, right? It starts with really understanding who you're working with?
Well,
or
kind of. I mean, the KPIs can't be established until you know the health history, past success, past failure, all those type of things, because the KPIs are where you're going to need the biggest buy-in, right? Because those are the drivers.
They have to believe it.
If they don't understand the drivers, and then they don't understand the success failure of those drivers, they're not always going to go up at the same time. Some are going to go up more so than others. Some are just not going to go up at all, because that's just how training is. So I mean and yes, I can say that's the coach's fault. You can still take responsibility, accountability, and all those other things, because if they don't go up, you shouldn't feel bad and think that you're a shitty coach because they didn't go up. Now, if they don't always go up, then you need to step back and be able to say, okay, what did we learn from this? Because sometimes the greatest gains come after the biggest failures. So you could be trying to drive one of these lifts up over a 4 month, 6 months, even a 9 month period. And it's like strike one, strike two, strike three, son of a bitch. What the hell is it? And then bam, it's a home run. And then instead of 20 pounds going on that lift, it's like 50, and people are like, holy shit, this worked. I put 50 pounds on my lift. And no, it didn't. It didn't do that in 4 weeks. It did it in all this because maybe we didn't develop the physical capabilities that were necessary as a base to allow this to happen, until then. Or we had to fail at all these to figure out what that needed to be.
Right, the information gathering, right? And it's a constant process. You're tweaking and adjusting, right? You have the plan, you have the goal in mind, but again, like you said, with the day-to-day, there's gonna be that variability between sessions, variability between weeks based on what's actually happening with the organism that you're working with, right? In their life, in their, who knows? Like, you can have the perfect, a perfect peak planned out based on all the information that you have, and then their dog dies, and now all of a sudden they're out. Who knows, right? There's all sorts of shit.
It happens all the time.
It happens all the time.
It happens all the time. It has to be accounted for, and not only that, but you don't want to have such rigid compliance that they're not living, like not going home because of the holidays, because I got to train. Granted, I did all that shit, but does it really matter if they move it a day or if they miss, what I'm saying? Those just have to be kind of known variables in the annual plan. So where it goes back to be careful how you schedule your deloads if that's part of this mesocycle wave, because they happen, right? So if you have it automatically scheduled, it's certain variables, say every 4th week for a full year. Now I can understand every 4th week in a peak phase, right? Because the loading and the recovery and everything's just so high. But if it's happening all year round, what is it, 12 weeks out of a year, that is. And then where's the holidays fall? So then you start ticking all that off. But what's the annual plan? Where do the peaks need to happen? Where do the holidays fall? And what religion are they? So what are their holidays? Where do they fall? Can that be structured as the deload? Can it, again, laying out an annual plan to be able to see where this all falls? Is it necessary to peak somebody if it's between the middle of November and the first of the year? Sometimes it most definitely is, because it's a competitive season for a lot of places. If it's not, and it's not a high-level athlete, is it necessary to put all those other things in there at that time? Yeah,
and I really think that one of the main drivers of that performance for your athletes and whatnot, it will depend entirely on your ability to understand yourself as a coach, right? You had mentioned that before. You had mentioned you have these systems in place from your experience, from the education that you have, but a lot of it comes from working with so many people, so many different types of people at different levels, at different parts of their life, and different competitive levels, body weights, this, that, everything. But having that self-reflective time to understand, it's like, okay, looking at this program, on paper it should work. Oh shit, it didn't work. Why? Figure it out.
Yeah, and it's a lot of times you're going to know what needs to be done. So you'll see the weak point. It's going to stick in your face. You're going to know exactly what it is. You know it needs to be done, but you got to ask yourself, how do we get there? Right? Because just blurting out what needs to be done may not be the path to be able to get there.
Mm-hmm.
So it's that's thinking it through, because getting there is not the same as suggesting to get there.
Right.
You know, it's completely different. And obviously the experience matters.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that plays a role, you know, and being able to, the backup plans, or another word to be able to put in there is just auto-regulating. Being able to auto-regulate is huge, because you may think you know what it is, but then it's not.
Mm-hmm.
And then you need to understand you're still going to mess it up a lot. So if this is what you know needs to be done, what if it doesn't work? Because there's a high probability it probably won't.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So what is the backup plan if this doesn't work? And if that is being done, what's the backup plan? And does that backup plan start after you realize it doesn't work, or does it run coinciding with this? So it's already in place if this doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
So that again falls back to, you got physical, mental, and technical issues. Right?
Yep.
So you may think this is a technical issue, but in the background, are you addressing what the physical issue could be and what the mental issue could be? Or are you just going to wait and see, oh shit, it wasn't that, so now let's work on the technical part.
Mm-hmm.
Oh shit, it wasn't that, so now let's work on that. Because your best educated guess might say it's one, doesn't mean you're right. You know, so I think they all need to be addressed to a certain degree.
Well, right. That was going to be what I was going to say, is like, okay, say it's like, oh, this is a physical issue, but it's going to have mental impacts on that athlete.
Well, say it's a technical. Yeah, let's
right?
say it's a technical issue, right? So it's like, okay, I don't like where the bar path is moving on their squat, right? And it's happening with the bar, it's happening with 95, it gets worse as they get heavier. Okay, we can fix that. We can work on that technically, but what if that's happening because their glutes are weak?
Mm-hmm.
Or what if it's happening because their hamstrings or their glutes and hamstrings both are so bad that when they go to sit down, it almost actually ends up becoming a free fall? And if that's the case, is it the quads that aren't breaking the way they should break?
Mm-hmm.
So, because what if it's that's causing the bar path to move the wrong way?
Right.
So there's that. Or what if they're just not focusing? Or what if they think it needs to move forward? You know, so there's all those variables that are there.
Wow. I mean, we're getting close to about 90 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you wanted to open it up to a few questions, or
Yeah, we'll take a few questions.
I know we got that was fantastic. I know everybody's going to probably, here we go. We got a few. First off, we got a lot of awesome super chats, some pretty big super chats, just kind of helping to support us, what we're doing. So that was a big shout out to everybody who's done that so far.
I want to I'll stop for a minute and thank all you guys for that, because again, as I said in the Q&A that I did, that's how we gauge what type of content you guys are looking for.
Right.
So if
huge.
this is the type of content that you're looking for from a table talk, you know, leave a comment, leave a super chat, hit the notification thing, leave a review on the podcast, because we're watching all this stuff, and the stuff that gets the highest downloads, most traffic, most comments, most reviews, that's the stuff that we're going to keep doing. The stuff that doesn't get, you know, the traction to show that this is what you guys like and are looking for, we got to keep looking to find what you guys want.
Mm-hmm.
So example being, you know, this is a little different direction, you know, for the podcast. So if the downloads suck, you know, when it comes to the podcast,
because we have KPIs, right?
Yeah, we get no reviews. There's no comments on the video. The video doesn't get a lot of hits. The super chats suck. Then we're not going to do this again, because apparently you guys don't like this.
Yep.
And we'll find something else to be able to do. So it's just a KPI. It's just an indicator to be able to track if we're going down the path that you guys want.
Mm-hmm. So we got one from our buddy Helmet. Ready?
Mm-hmm.
Contacts recreational lifter coming back from 5-year layoff through sickness, 33 years old, no muscle strength. No muscle/strength. Okay, cool. Learning conjugate on my own from scratch or hire a coach. Goal is to get healthy, strong, and muscular.
Well, if you've listened to the podcast, you probably already take away that you need to learn on your own. That would be where I'm going to go with that. So the advice I would have for you, if you're coming back from 5 years, is you already know that 5 years isn't as long of a period of time as people think it is. Because think back to when you were training before. It doesn't seem that long ago, right? So where do you want to be 4 years from now? Plot that out, come up with whatever that objective is, and then start working back from there from a realistic perspective and move forward in that direction.
Beautiful. Perfect. Thank you, Helmet, for that. That was, I know he's supported us in the past quite a bit, so that's really, really good to see. Drew Poland, I'd love to spend time with Dave on squat. Have worked with Kurt K, Josh Bryan on my bench, Pete Rubish on my dead, and Dave is my last unicorn. How do we make this happen? I'll start driving right now if that's the case.
I don't know yet.
Let's see. One just came in. Thanks for all the free content. I'm wondering, can you buy a polo shirt, short sleeve shirt, Elite FTS, just like Dave has?
This is a button down.
It says greetings from Croatia.
We don't have these. These are like staff shirts, I suppose. But we have a lot of other T-shirts. Check the site out. To go back to the other thing of the person asking about coming out, the reason I said I don't know is at some point in time, the problem with the consulting and the stuff that I do on the weekends is if I open this up, then I have no way to vet who's coming. And so then I end up with a bunch of people, and that's fine. That's cool. But if I end up having 3 people on a weekend at the same time, and they're so vast in their training objectives and goals, it becomes very hard to help them the way that they need to be helped, where it's not going to be, people aren't going to like the price that I would throw out if it's just one person for the weekend. So it's trying to figure out, how to structure the train your ass off type of things, to vet it out, to be able to allow that to happen without completely disrupting my entire life. So I'm working on it. Let's put it that way. Right now, the consulting that I do is kind of like underground. People know how to get a hold of me, and I just kind of work it out that way.
Awesome. One more question just came in. Any book recommendations? It's kind of a common one.
Well, based upon what we talked about earlier, I would say from the basic perspective, the NSCA, what the hell is it called? The book that you're going to use to study for the CSCS. Yeah. That would be one that I would put out there, just to learn the basics, guys. There's a lot of other books that are out there. I'm better with the book question if I'm like looking at all my books to be able to say a lot of the things that I would put out there. If it's, reading Bompa, reading Ursula, and reading some of these other, and some of the books that we saw on the site, I really think at this point in time, from what I've been seeing, they're coming in way over the head of a lot of people, because they haven't, this is my speculation, they haven't spent time in the trenches reading training materials. Their time spent in the trenches has been watching YouTube videos, looking at podcasts and member sites and stuff like that. So they're getting their content through disseminated sources instead of going directly to the source. So I think it's time for people to start taking a pause, going back directly to the source. So when I throw things out there like Super Training and Bompa and all these other people open it up and like, oh shit, it's too much. So then back it down a little bit more, go from there. What's that dude's name? There's a guy on YouTube that's done a really good job of breaking programs down. Bromley?
Bromley. Yep, that's the second time we mentioned him.
Yeah, check out his thing, because he's got a lot of good information out there. He's got a base building book, which is really good too, because it just shows kind of the basic structures with
Alexander
a lot of
Bromley.
It shows a lot of the structures with a lot of the inner workings within a training block, mesocycle phase, again, whatever you want to call that.
Empire barbell.
Yes, but where I think his information can really help people is watching him diagnose programs that are out there, because you're going to be able to see some of these loading patterns that we're talking about, how they're implemented, sometimes how they're not really implemented that effectively. So that's a good source too. It's free, so this information's good. So yeah, there's that. I have recommended him before, because he's a good educator.
He's
man.
Great.
He does a good job.
And that's something. Because for everybody watching this who don't know, me and Dave meet fairly regularly and just kind of just talk programming and just kind of go over these concepts together, because it's so important to, just keep the knife sharp, right? Keep the tools sharp. And it's funny because Dave will come out of his office with this like mess of pages and like a binder kind of sticking out of it, and there's like notes and everything's highlighted and everything, and I'm like, this is the sauce, right? This is the stuff that's going to make the biggest impact. And it's cool to see because it's the sources, it's the people who were in the trenches originally that created these concepts, and it's these older texts, and it's like, this is where the basics began, and this is why the basics are the basics, and everything that's so higher end complicated now, it all boils down from this.
Well, things evolve too,
right?
So a lot of the basics have evolved to a certain point. Things the stew has been made with different ingredients, right?
Right.
So it creates better stew over a period of time, but the ingredients are still all the same. So it's looking at that, but understanding how you make it is important for everybody, because biases do fuck things up, especially if you're selling programs and that's how you earn your living. And I understand that. I get that. That's the industry. But it's not the end all be all. And the only way you're going to know that is to be able to know what are the ingredients and how they work. And when you start digging back deep enough, you begin to see all these things are kind of the same. They're just called different things. A month, a mesocycle, a phase, a block. What is it? Well, it's designated time period of training that isn't really short and it isn't really long. It's kind of like right in the middle. So and I get how the industry works, but I think people need to understand more. Maybe I need to do a better job of educating people more on how that industry really does work, because people need to position themselves to be able to sell their programs. We sell products. We sell equipment, t-shirts, gym bags, bands, tons of bands. We sell anything that you need to be able to get stronger. Like, what do we say? Anything you put in a gym bag or load plates
on a bar, yeah.
That's what we sell, right? So I never wanted to get really heavy into selling the training education component, because then I become a whore of that component and not an educator of that component. Where when you're an educator of that component, you can look at things broadly and be able to say, guys, look, this is what you need to learn.
You boil it down.
Yes, and you can learn from everybody, even the snake oil salesman. You can learn from everybody. There's stuff to be able to learn, but I don't want that price tag attached to what I'm saying, because we generate this content for free based upon the support you guys give us through the shopping cart sales and stupid clicks and views and all the other stuff that we're trying to, I guess I am kind of whoring that now, right? Like the subscribers, clicks and views.
There's always room for a little whore.
Yeah, so there's always a little bit of that in there. But that's what is able to keep things, and I don't even know if I could be a huge, training style whore. I've been pigeon-toed a lot of different times, but
yeah.
I don't even know where that all went. I guess the point I'm trying to make is we have no vested interest on trying to push any certain training agenda. Our training agenda is for you guys to get better. That's it. You get better, you train longer, you last longer, and you buy more of our shit. So there's it.
Well, that's a perfect way to end it, guys. If you like this video, make sure you share it out. Subscribe to us on the podcast. Please write a review. We want to know how we're doing. If you have any more questions, put them down below in the video. Again, share it out, whatever form you can do that with your friends, your enemies, your training partners, your coaches. I think this particular podcast was probably one of the better ones that we could have ever made, because this is so important for so many people to hear.
And we'll see.
It feels good.
Yeah, it feels good. We'll see how it's received. I mean, we could just go back to talking about stupid shit next week.
Right. Absolutely. We'll bring the nachos back.
Yeah.
But all right, guys, thank you very much for joining in, and we will see you in the next one.
Thank you.